So, hello, welcome back, everyone. Now, our next presenter is Nina Pollak, speaking about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, which is actually identity and access management, a topic that I usually spend a lot of time with and fiddling around. And she's going to show us a very easy way to do it in Azure. So, welcome, Nina. The stage is yours.
Okay, hi, welcome everybody. So my name is, as Matthias already um, said, is Nina. So I work with a lot of customers in the Azure space, also with Azure Active Directory, B2C, and other technologies. And you can find my blog here and also my GitHub repository. And every source code that I show, I will publish it later. It will not be available immediately because I have just to make some fixes, but it will then be available in a few hours or so. So before I want to jump into the demo, because it's a very demo-focused session, I want to dwell a bit on the topic why you should use an identity service or for end customers or for anything. Because if you do identity, it's not easy to do identity management, and you have to consider a lot of things like security monitoring, detecting any anomalies, or multi-factor authentication. Sorry, I have to turn on my timer so that we can end in the right time. So you have to do multi-factor authentication. You have to handle distributed denial of services attacks. You have to do the scaling depending on how large your service will be. And so writing a secure code is really hard, but writing the authentication authorization code is even harder. So you should always depend on ready libraries and also the service. And Azure Active Directory B2C is one of these services. So there are multiple services available from other vendors, of course, but Azure Active Directory B2C is really focusing on end customers. So it's not for business to business. So it's really more targeting end customers. So if you want to build your next Facebook or you want to build your next Twitter or another application, you can use that service to host your users and manage the users in there. It's a part of the Microsoft Identity Platform, so it supports, so it's built on the same foundation and the same security concepts. It uses OpenAuth and OpenID Connect and also SAML as providers or as protocols. And it offers all these nice things like the scaling, the safety, the monitoring, the threat mitigation, and the denial of service things and other things. So that's the plan for the agenda today. So first I will show you how you can create an Azure Active Directory B2C, what it will be costing approximately, um, how you can do the basic branding and localization, and I will configure a simple Azure Active Directory app. I will show you how you can configure identity providers. I have to fix that typing error. Show you how to work the user attributes works and the user flows and the journeys work. And then we will do integration with EasyAuth, which is a very easy way to add authentication to your Azure web app. And then we will have, if we have some time, we will look into API connectors, which is a very easy way to extend this flow. And if we even have more time, which I doubt, then I can show you how you can integrate custom domains as well. With that said, I want to jump into the demo. So the first thing, I will switch into my Azure Active Directory. And you can see in this resource group, I have already generated 2 Azure Active Directory B2C tenants. So to create those, you need an Azure subscription, of course. You need a resource group where you put those, and you say simply B2C. And there you can create the Active Directory. So if you have already created some directory tenant and you want to link it with an Azure subscription for billing, then you can do that here. Or you go directly here to create the tenant. So we'll give it an organization name and you will give it an initial domain name. So it will be something at .onmicrosoft.com. So it will be the same like in Azure Active Directory, but you can change that later so that your users that come to your page never will see that that's basically hosted on Microsoft. So you can do your custom domain. Then you have to select the region, which is very important because it basically defines where all this user data is stored. So right now it's, of course, in the United States. So if I select Austria, it would be in a regional data center. Yes, and then you just would say create, and this would create your directory. So I will skip that because I already have created that. And in the settings, if you click here, you can't do a lot of things. But one thing that you can do is you can change the pricing tier. And I have, take the right one, sorry. Sorry, my voice is a bit, my throat is a bit inflamed, so I have some difficulties speaking. The pricing tier defines which features you have. So basically, since it's not very expensive, you can switch to the premium P2. It might get more expensive if you use over 50,000 users, because right now the billing works in a way that you have monthly active users. So if a user signs in with her or him's account, then they are one monthly active user. So if I sign in a dozen times or 100 times a month, it doesn't matter. I'm only one active monthly user in that month. So if more users sign in, then they count to this number. And if you have under 50,000 users, monthly active users, you won't be billed for anything except for multi-factor authentication with short message services. So with the phone, you will be billed there. And yeah, there's a few differences. So I always select these because I don't have a lot of users. So you have more security features with that one. Then you have to switch to the tenants, which you can do up here usually. I will switch directly to my B2C tenant with a link because I don't want to show all my tenants. And here you have this, yes, like let's go back to home. So you have the Azure Active Directory, which is basically the normal Azure Active Directory. And a lot of functionality will be found there. Like, for example, the custom domain settings. You can change the custom domain settings here, and you can see that I already have registered login.spectralogic.eu. But for the main things, you will always use this one, the Azure Active Directory B2C. And this is where you can create your application registrations. Also, what you want to do is to do some company branding to make the look and feel a bit better. And you can do that very easily here. And usually you can define it for each language, or you can just take the default and you have to upload some images. So it's quite straightforward. I don't think I don't need to spend much time on it. Or you only have to pay attention to the file size. It's really 10,000 bytes. So you can't go further than 10,000 bytes, and can be challenging sometimes if you have special logos. Yes, and yes, and when you want to create an application, you have to do an application registration. So it's the same thing you do when you need something that represents your application in the Azure Active Directory, and this is what you do under app registrations. So you go to app registrations and you say you want to create a new Azure application. And then you have to select the supported account types. And this is very important that you take this one for your end users, because it's the way how the users will act as end customer users. So these two options are mostly for your internals. So when I'm logged into this tenant right now, in the Azure portal, for example, I'm logged with my organizational directory account in this Azure Active Directory instance. And you also can use that, for example, to create APIs to access the Azure Graph from other applications or from other services to write into this tenant. And then you would use these types of applications. But for the applications you write for your end customers, you always take this option. Then you can select the platform. We will use web, and then you give it a callback URL, and you give it access, of course, that you can create OpenID OpenID tokens, and you also can create refresh tokens. Then you would register the application. I already have done that as well. So I go back here. Very important is you always need this application client ID, so it's a good idea to copy that to your clipboard and then into a notepad or something. And then in the authentication, you can see that I have registered 2 callback URLs. So one is the jot.ms, so I can test later when we create our tokens and we want to watch the tokens without having deployed an application. You always should create a secret when you make downstream calls, for example, and you will need application secrets to create access tokens. So you might want to create those as well. But it's not something which we need right now. I have set everything here, yes. So the next thing would be to configure your application identity providers. So the identity providers are actually those who provide identity services. And one is the built-in, and it's a local account. The local account is built into the Azure Active Directory B2C and allows customers to sign in with either the email, the username, or the phone number. So you can select either of them, or you can select all. But for one flow, and we will see what a flow is later, you can select only one. So, but you have multiple options here. Then you can create other or add other identity providers, and you have pre-configured a lot of here from, for example, Facebook. And you find always a link up here where you have a very detailed description what you can have to do, what steps you have to take in a Facebook identity provider, for example. So I switch quickly to the Facebook page, and you will have to add this Facebook login. And in the settings, you will have to, aside from giving data protection URLs, you will have to add your redirects. And if you have custom domains, you will have to pay attention that you do the right redirects with your custom domain. So once you have done that, you have registered your OpenID Connect providers. And you can even create a new OpenID Connect providers. You can give all these details. So if you have another provider that's not listed here, you can use that as well. Okay. The next thing which we'll look at is user attributes. So a lot of data is stored in the Azure Active Directory, and data that is stored in the Azure Active Directory usually should be associated with the user. So I wouldn't store any preferences for some applications there. So if you have any application settings or application specific things, I would rather store that with the application and not within the Azure Active Directory B2C tenant. So this is really something that's all about the person and their profile. You can store some additional information like some IDs you want to share or some loyalty IDs that work all out through your organization, then you can do that. But I would keep that a bare minimum only to add those attributes that you really need. Yes, you have a lot of built-in attributes here, and you also can create your custom attributes, and you can give them the data type string, boolean, or int. I've created 2 of those, which is the Advanced Developer Community Day ID. I still have difficulties spelling that name right. And then have loyalty ID, which is, for example, a customer loyalty, and you see I have some troubles with typing. Okay. Once we have created all our user attributes, we have to ensure that the people who sign up to our services can enter those. So we will create a user flow now. And a user flow is basically a journey that you take or a user journey is basically something where you guide your users through a process during the sign up or adding their profile or resetting their password. And you can create these user flows, and there are standard user flows, and you can also create custom user flows with this identity experience framework, which is a pretty tough thing to do. So you really should be experienced if you want to work with that. So I have done a few things with the identity experience framework, and I can say it's a bit hard. It's not as easy as you would think it is, but you can always refer to the user flows if you don't need any very special things. you can create a new user flow here, and you have different options for journeys. One journey is the sign up and sign in, which is my preferred journey because it provides the best experience for end users, because they will be presented with a screen to log in or sign up, and can do the sign up from the login screen as well. If you have something like a portal where you only can sign in your users and they don't sign up ever, they are signed up or provisioned by you, then you can use the sign-in policy for the sign-in flow, for example. And then you have, of course, flows for profile editing and password reset. There is now an option. Originally, when you used this flow, you had when the user clicks on password reset, you would receive a token back to your application or an error message back to your application with the information that the user wants to reset the password, and you would have to trigger this user journey to make the password reset. But this has recently changed, so you can do that now from here. So you won't especially need that really. So we click that, and we always take the recommended version, not the legacy one. And all the names will always start with this absolutely weird prefix. And then you give it a name like sign up, sign in, which is the most common name which people use, sign up, sign in. And yes, I know that you have. Then you will select your identity providers. So this basically defines for this journey what kind of identity providers you want to allow. So you can say, okay, you can sign up with the email address, and you see this as a not a checkbox, but it's a selection. So if you have phone and the other thing options which we had earlier, then you can select only one. And then you can say, okay, I also want to allow that people can log in with their social provider, Facebook, for example. Yes, if you have configured other identity providers, they will show up here as well. Then you can define multi-factor authentication if you want to have that. Sorry, I have to interrupt for a moment. Sorry. You can define, for example, you want to do email, or you can, and this is a recent addition, you can also use Authenticator app now, which is a very convenient way because you spare the money for these SMS phone calls, because email is very cumbersome to use, and SMS would be the only very user-friendly option, but the even more user-friendly option is the Authenticator app. You can turn the MFA enforcement on or off, and you also can set it to conditional, and that's where conditional access comes in play. And this is something which you always also find in Azure Active Directory. And when you use conditional access, then you will define conditional access policies, and you can define them. I don't want to switch back here. Oops, sorry. Yes, and then you can define these conditional policies, and depending on these policies, multi-factor authentication will be enforced or not. You have this checkbox here, and the reason why you have this checkbox here is if you check that checkbox additionally, and you have a condition that says block that user, the user will be blocked and not able to log in. If you don't check this box here, then the user might get an MFA enforcement, but they will not be blocked. Then, of course, you have to say which kind of user attributes and tokens do you want to collect from the user during the sign-up process. And in there you can say, for example, I want to have the given name, I want to have the surname, I want to have the city, and all the things you want to collect. And you can click on Show More to see all the options. And then you have the second column, and the second column defines basically what kind of return claims do you want to get back. So once this user flow is executed and the user signs in or signs up, when the process or the user journey is completed, you will receive a token to your application which contains a lot of claims, and you can define exactly what kind of claims you want to receive. So you can say you want to have this ADCD ID back, you want to have the city, you want to have the display name, email address, and whatson, you name it. You always have the email addresses instead of the email. You also get the information if the user is new, so you will know if the user has signed up just right now. And you also will get the user object ID. Please note that this is very important, that the user object ID is not identical over multiple identity providers. So if you, for example, allow a user to sign up with their Facebook account and also allow them to sign up with their local account, those accounts are not linked automatically together. You can do some steps to do that, but this is not automatically. So you will get a specific user ID. That's for some reasons, because and that's the reason why some users or some customers, for example, use to create a new ID field filled out with a unique value depending on, for example, their email, which has other difficulties. But then you can find these accounts together. So once you have created that flow, and I've already created these flows, we can look into more details of these flows, and we can do a lot of things there as well. So you can control the token lifetime, you can control the compatibility settings, you can define where you will see the user flow. So every time the user logs in with one of these flows, you will get a claim that's called TFP by default, and it will contain the name of this user journey. Yeah, you can define a session behavior. For example, you can say you want to have a single sign-on experience. So when application you sign in, you can sign in to any other applications seamlessly. You don't have to log in again. Or you can really say, for this application, I want to really have the user log in again. Also, you can define a password policies. I always change that because I hate it when people require to add some stupid symbol numbers, which always ends in people using one and exclamation mark at the end of their password. So I like that, so I switched it off, but I require a minimum length of 16 characters, which makes it much harder to figure out the password. Here again, you can find the user attributes and the application claims you will receive. There's also this neat thing, application connectors, which helps you to avoid this identity experience framework in some cases. So you can use that, for example, to inject things. You can, for example, after you have federated with an identity provider like Facebook, for example, you can do some claims transformations. You can change claims that come back from that identity provider, or you can create user IDs. You can do verification checks with organizations that check the validity of persons, or check if they are fluid with money. I don't know the expression in English, sorry. A credibility, so they make a credibility check, for example. You can do this before creating the user. What you also can do, and this is what we see in the demo later, you can also create or change the claims that come in. But to do that, you always have to send in these user attributes. So you always have to collect these user attributes. Which brings me to the next topic, and right now we want to just try that out. So you can say, anytime you can say run this user flow, you select the application, you select the reply URL, which is in this case jot.ms, and we run the user flow. And then I click Facebook because it's the easiest way for me to log in. And then we will receive our claim back. And then we will see all this nice information. We will see our extension ID and everything. And I just wanted to show a different thing. If you sign up now, you always, and this is what I wanted to point out, is that you will see these items as well. And these are not items you want to see. We want to have the user see these items. So you have to change that. And you can do that by going into the page layouts. and you can edit these page layouts, and you can build CSS to change that and remove that. And it would go over the scope of the session to show you this. Unfortunately, it's very easy to do. So you can drop me a line by email or by something if you want to know how to do it. It's actually quite easy, but you can copy that URL, this custom page URL, for example, can download it from there and can work from that one, for example. Yes, another thing I have forgotten to mention is this enables JavaScript. If you enable that and you enable the self-service password reset, then you won't need this extra flow with the reset password from the user. So if I go in here and I forgot my password, usually I would get an error back into the, in this case, into the chat.ms, I would get an error back that the user has forgotten their password and you need to send them to another journey. But if you have enabled these things, you can click here and the user will be redirected here to send a verification code and change their password. Oops, I don't change that. Okay. I hope I have covered everything that I wanted to mention. Yes. So customizing the page layouts can take a lot of time. So you want to think about it, especially when it's getting to custom languages. So you can change every aspect and everything you see or the user will see. You can change it. You have default settings. You can enable the language customization, and you can change everything in here. But it allows you to download JSON files, so you can automate this process a bit. But it's really a lot of work, and you might want to avoid that. Okay, so let's look at how we can do the authentication, how we can use that in our Azure Active Directory applications. So I've created some Azure Web App applications, and I select this one. And in here you have a very easy way to add authentication. You just go to this authentication settings. You say add identity provider. Select Microsoft Identity Azure Active Directory. And in this case, you have to provide the details for the existing application registrations. So you will take the client ID, copy it in. You will take the client secret. All right, I have to change that later. It's always good when you do online presentations and you post your secrets. And then you have to set the issuer. The issuer you can find when you go back here. You can find the issuer in the application registrations. And this is what I've forgotten to mention previously. You go to endpoints, and then you have there the OpenID Connect metadata endpoint. And this is basically the link you have to add. In my case, it's this one. And I use, as you can see, my custom domain. In this case, I would change that part of the URL and set the tenant to the ID so that my end users don't see this strange on Microsoft domain names. Then I also can set the allowed token audiences, so I always use the application itself. And then you can restrict the access. You can say you allow unauthenticated access, and then you have to handle the sign-in process yourself. You have to redirect the users to actually sign in when you're not signed in. If you say, on the other hand, require authentication, nobody can access the application unless they have signed in with this identity, with your identity solution. Yeah, you can decide what happens if you have unauthenticated requests. So if you have APIs, you probably want to return unauthorized. For applications, you will return a redirect to the login. You can change that here. It's always the default. So when you have added these, and I've already done that, you immediately get, let me start it. You immediately get this in this dialog, and you can sign it. It's completely, how do I say, any URL you will enter will bring you here. So you can't skip that, you can't fake that. So you have to sign in if you have the settings set to always sign in. And once you sign in, then you will get to the application. I have already published the application, and we will look in a moment how we create such an application. I just have to check the time, and I think we are good. So this is an application. We'll return our username, our user email address. It will return our loyalty ID and also this ACD, another one. You always also can try out this application. So if you have a browser open and you don't want to listen to my talk, you can try that out. So, and for that, I will switch back to creating an ASP.NET Core application. I will need to switch to my console. And I've created a directory which is empty right now. And there's some neat templates that you can use to create an application. And you need to give a lot of parameters. You need to provide, of course, the framework version. You need to provide that you want to use individual business to consumer. And then you can provide all these user flows that you have defined, one for the sign up, sign in, one for the password reset, and one for the edit profile. And then you give it the B2C instance and the application ID, which is from the application registration. You can define the domain name and the tenant ID, and it will create you a ready to run application that you can open up in Visual Studio. So if we want to do that right now, we start the application. Let me show you the app settings. So in the app settings, you get automatically generated this Azure Active Directory B2C. You will see all these settings here. And it took me a time to find out that this strange URL is actually generated because I always use SUSE myself as some name for testing. I found out that Microsoft also uses the name SUSE, and they create this weird URL. You can change that to anything else. Yes, what else is added, which is of importance? So one thing that is added is this Builder Services authentication scheme and Microsoft Identity Web App Builder Configuration Get Settings. So until recently, a year ago, or a bit more than a year ago, you wouldn't have been able to integrate it with the Azure Active Directory Easy Auth. So we have we have set this authentication here, which basically makes anything automated. And if you have written an application about 1.5 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to write an application that makes use of these settings. But since the last year or so, you can actually use that to get all the claims principal back. So when you set that and you configure that right, you can run this application locally. And this is also what you have to add. You have to add the Microsoft Identity UI, and you have, of course, to have authentication authorization enabled. And if we run the demo right now, I hopefully will, yes. You will see that demo. You can click on sign in. You will be redirected to your sign in page and it won't work. And I know why. Yes. The reason why it doesn't work is because I haven't used exactly that in my application registration. And so I will switch back to another application. The reason for that, let me show you that very briefly. In the application registration, of course, you have to define the right return URLs. And if you don't have defined the right return URLs, and I think this is the application I'm using, so it's not the same port. And that's the reason why it didn't work. But luckily, oops. Okay, let me. I want to show my desktop, please. Okay, can do it the hard way. I open my demo application. So that's a bit more advanced thing. So let me start that. I did some additions to that, but you can see that when you download the source code from my GitHub repository. I've added these informations here. So you can click on sign in, then you will get the sign in page locally, and then you can sign in, for example, with Facebook. And you will get all these nice details. You can do the sign out, you can do the editing profile, and this will also bring you back here. You always, and this is very important to know, you always can customize this look and feel to a great extent because you can do that with CSS. So you should match the branding between your application and your identity service. Sometimes in this case, when you use Azure Active Directory B2C Easy off, and you can just publish that application, and this is what I have done previously. And when we started this application, which I've showed you a bit earlier. So let me check. I'm sorry, I need to go back to the this is this application. I've published it here. And even if I would turn off the authentication here, the application would start. Right now, if I log in here, or if I navigate to this page, I would have to sign in. I already signed in. That's the reason why you see me signed in, but I wouldn't be able to access the application because I'm not signed in. But when I run the application locally, you have seen I could see the pages. I could see the start page, but you wouldn't see the start page because of my settings here in the authentication. So because I've said that I require authentication, Azure Active Directory Web App will make sure that you are authenticated before you even get to your application. And that's the reason why you have log in. You have to log in before. So when I sign out here, I will have to sign in. So I won't be able to access this page. And that's the big difference. Previously that I have also provided a sample, and I can't go into details of this sample, but you can look at this sample in the Azure repo. I've also provided another example, which is using, and that's the wrong one. It's this easy all sample. This will actually show you how you can do that without the Microsoft Identity libraries. So it will show you how you can process that token that Microsoft generates for you. So easy authentication, or this Azure App Authentication, how it's called nowadays, will always inject a header which contains the token. And you, of course, can process the token. And Microsoft will make sure that this token is valid, so you don't have to do any validity checks on that token. It also prevents that you inject the token from outside, and then you can process the token yourself, which is a bit cumbersome. This is why I have written a NuGet package, which is only for demo purposing, so I wouldn't use that in production, but it's for demo purposing, and you can use that and can see the implementation of this, how you can write an identity provider that works with Azure Active Directory easy auth. So, and since we are short of time, I will now switch and show you very quickly how you can add this, these API connectors. The first thing you need to know when you write API connectors is that they have a special kind of defining how your where is it? Yes, they have a very special way how they send you these custom attributes. They send you a post to your service with the claims, then you can modify that and you basically send those as a result back. And for some reasons, the custom attributes are not like custom attribute or extension custom attributes. They are always in a format that's called extension app ID custom attribute. And the documentation is not very correct here because it's not only the extension app ID, it's the extension app ID in lowercases and without the hyphens. And if you don't take care, then your integration won't work. And because this is a very cumbersome process, I have just decided to make it a bit simpler, and I have written NuGet packages with a code generator that can make it a bit easier. So you can simply create an Azure function to do that, to do this interceptor. And I have created an Azure function here, and I've added two NuGet packages. And this is these API connectors and API connectors generators. And this will allow you to create a claims request, and you can define your custom claims up here, and it will generate code for this partial class, and it will create properties for these with the extension app ID. And you can provide that in any format. It will make sure that it's formatted correctly. So you can see always the generated code if you go in here and open that up. And you can see that it generates a JSON property for extension underscore the application ID and the property, and then you have the property. So this allows you to then in your application. And you have two ways to authenticate to that kind of application, to that service. You can either use basic authentication, which please don't do that. Use certificates, so it's only for demo purposes. You can use this. So you take some username and password, and then you will provide a function that's called, for example, enrich claims. Then you have to deserialize that input. And this is exactly what I've shown you earlier. So it's exactly this kind of format you will get. You can just then deserialize that. You can change the things, and now you can see that you have IntelliSense and you have this property, which is generated by the code generator. You can return that, you can add and modify it, and then you can just send it back. And I have written some things that make it a bit easier. So I have this claims response, and I also have written some classes that you can send back error response messages, so that in the user flow, the user will see an error if something goes wrong, and then you can block the sign in or the sign up process. So the authentication is just handled here, simple basic authentication. I have published that already. And now we have less than 2 minutes to show you how you can add that API here. So you will go into API connectors. I've already added it here. So you really would go to add API connector. You would enter a display name, the endpoint URL. You would then select, of course, certificate and not basic. But in our case, we have basic. And then you can go to your average, to your user flows. And in our user flow, and I'm not sure which one, you go to the API connectors and you just select those. I saved that connector. So I also will do it here because I'm not sure which kind of policy I've used. And when we now start this application again, and I sign in with my Facebook account, you can see that the application, the ADCD ID, has added this prefix connector. So before the claims are returned, my Azure function was called. So I have modified the code like I showed you inside here. So I've modified it here. I added this connector. And this allowed us to change the claim here. And this is also how you can generate, for example, the unique IDs. If you see that the user signs up with a similar email that you have already in your system, you can give them the same ID and map those users together, for example. That would be a way how you can use these connectors. So I think that concludes my session. I haven't made it able to show you the custom domains, but maybe I can do that in another demo or a blog post. So I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you liked my session. You will find the code in a few hours here on this URL. You might also be interested in my session, the Azure Call Bootcamp, on the 6th of May. I will show you how you can secure SaaS APIs with Azure API management from third party. And yeah, you can join the next session from this event in approximately 10 minutes, 30 minutes. So thank you very much for your attention and have a great day.